Welcome, friends. This is a kind of explanation video review of the Metaphysics of Tsunamis by Jean-Pierre Dupuy. I think his name is pronounced Dupuy. It's embarrassing for me to say Dupuy too many times in one video. I'm not going to make it through it, so I'm going to just pretend it's Dupuy. So, yeah, that's what I'm going to say, but I have no idea how to pronounce his name. He's a French philosopher. Focusing a lot on catastrophes. He's got some other books called one book is called The Mark of the Sacred, which I think it's about like the kind of underlying, I think I could be wrong, the underlying religious dimension to kind of global capitalism and economy and so on. So he's got some really interesting takes on stuff, and he's written a book, Metaphysics of Tsunamis. This book came out, I think, about 10 years ago. I'm not sure the exact date, but it wasn't recent. It wasn't too recent. It's a pretty good book, short. It brings up a lot of interesting topics. I'd read it years ago, but I wanted to reread and do a video because of the lockdowns and the theme of crisis and catastrophe, which makes it more, we have more kind of empirical observation, we could say. We have, in order to actually reflect on what he was arguing and so on. So, just as a kind of basic introduction to the text, he's doing something what he calls enlightened doomsdaying. We're gonna see what that means throughout the video, but just a quote from him here, which is, quote, "The prophet of doom is not heard because of his words, even if they issue from secure knowledge and true information. Do not manage to penetrate the system of beliefs held by those to whom they are addressed. It is not enough to know in order to accept what one knows and then to act on it. Our ability not to see when faced with the obviousness of suffering and atrocities is the principal obstacle that the prophet of doom must at least find a way around if he cannot actually overcome it." So that's kind of this is kind of a bit of a summary of what the enlightened doomsdaying is about. It's a sort of, it's not like let's empirically prove something. It's dealing more with belief. It's investigating why we can believe something, why we can kind of know something is happening, but we don't quite believe that it's happening. It's quite influenced by another thinker who's kind of an Austrian Jewish thinker, who I think worked with, I could be wrong, but I think he was one of Heidegger's kind of disciples. I'm not 100% on that, but I think he might have been. Who wrote a lot about, he's dead now, but he he died in the 90s, but he wrote a lot about Holocausts, and he wrote a lot about the potential of nuclear war as well. So this book, Metaphysics of Tsunamis, is also going to investigate a philosophy of evil. And it's going to basically kind of talk about catastrophes and how they differ. Like, for example, we can have natural catastrophes and moral catastrophes, and that's the basic two. He's gonna discuss how they interplay with each other. So catastrophe and ethics. He says our era is marked by, quote, possibly the possibility of catastrophe and possibly cosmic responsibility that falls to humanity trying to avert catastrophe. So this is very much an investigation of, and we could say, I think he was quite, I think that he predicted, in a sense, a change in our ethics, which crisis response will sort of accelerate, in the sense of a heightened sense of responsibility. And we can think of the lockdowns, for example, of, all of a sudden I'm supposed to be responsible for my, wearing a mask here, not wearing a mask here, doing this, what medicine I take. I'm suddenly thinking about my viral load or my viral influence in a way which I previously hadn't thought about it. Now, he didn't talk about viruses in this book at all. It's just that is an example of a changing ethics from the kind of traditional enlightened liberal ethics, which catastrophe brings about. It's going to heighten a heightened sense of responsibility, and there's problems with that too, which I'm going to go into. So don't worry, I'm not saying any of this just to endorse it or anything. So he basically rejects Rawlsian distributive justice. So Rawls, I think, in one section, talks about distributive justice as it pertains to future generations. And he rejects this kind of more contractual distributive philosophy as he thinks it's merely virtual. Thinking of like my great grandchildren is so virtual, because I don't even know if I'll have children. I don't know. I could die before I have children. I don't know if my children will have children, or they could die before they have children, and so on. It's kind of it kind of operates merely as this kind of intellectual, abstract sense of an object, which we don't even know if it's going to be there or not, which doesn't really invoke a strong sense of responsibility. He kind of dismisses that as being merely virtual. Instead, we need to think about responsibility for humanity proper, not like 3 generations down the road. This, like, we're talking about humanity proper, because humanity proper involves the future and it involves the present as well. He also, and this is an interesting point, and I'll criticize this a bit more at the end, but he talks about alarmism. So he argues if doomsdaying changes our actions, which then averts catastrophe, you can't then accuse the doomsdayers as alarmists. Catastrophe not happening doesn't prove them wrong. So basically, if we act as if something's bad is going to happen, and we change our actions, and then that thing doesn't happen because of our changed actions, somebody can't then come along and say, wait, hold, well, you were wrong to demand this of us, or to do this, because this big catastrophe never actually occurred. And it's like, well, it didn't occur because we changed. So he's attacking, and this is another interesting question for the if we think about COVID, if we think about the lockdowns, because that was one of the big contentions, of course, was demanding people make certain sacrifices or do certain things, which then arguably, in order to avert things which arguably don't happen, then you have an argument of like, well, that never happened, so why did you ask us to do this? And then, well, did we avert it by doing this thing? And we don't really know. It's like, did the lockdowns, for example, stop billions of people dying? Did the vaccine stop millions of people dying? We don't really know, because we did it. So the thing which was predicted was averted. But then at the same time, if we hadn't, because we don't have an example of us not making those changes, we also don't know whether that thing would have happened anyway. We just don't really know. So it's something you really saw play out in the lockdowns. In one section, he talks about the Lisbon tsunami, which happened in 1755, and this was a pretty big tsunami. I think it was an earthquake off that coast of Portugal, and it caused a tsunami, and it killed like 30,000 people. It was a pretty big event. And Rousseau and Voltaire were both alive at the time, and they actually exchanged some letters and kind of arguments about the catastrophe and how we should interpret it and how we should think about it and so on. So this section is very much a dealing with theodicy, and theodicy, for people that don't know, is the argument that God's existence is not contradicted by the existence of evil in the world. So, like, how could God exist if this evil exists? Well, theodicy is basically the argument that, like, the world can facilitate evil and God still be perfect and real at the same time. So this argument is the distinction in Rousseau and Voltaire's interpretation of that catastrophe, or response to that catastrophe of 1755 in Lisbon, is very much an argument over theodicy, is what he's trying to say. So Rousseau responded by saying that basically that we bring about our own evil, that we're always kind of participating in evil in the world, even if it's like really not apparent, right? That I've done anything to do that, that we as humans bring that about. So I think one of the arguments was that we can't stop an earthquake from happening and a tsunami from hitting us, but how exposed we are to it, or perhaps how prepared we are for it as well, is within human control. So therefore, if the crisis was this bad, we still kind of didn't do what we could have done in order to prepare for it for a better outcome. So we are still kind of responsible, even if it's seemingly completely contingent and out of our control. So for example, I think when tsunami hit, I think it was somewhere in like East Asia, I can't remember where, a few years ago, well, like 10 years ago, I think, or was it like 15 years ago? Well, anyway, recently enough, there was a lot of geophysicists and geoscientists saying, well, if you investigated more money in like tidal wave alarm systems and so on, that would have meant that you would have got more people out of your city or your town, and then like gotten to higher ground, and then that would have averted you wouldn't have as much death. So there's a kind of injunction of responsibility for the fact that they were that exposed. So that would be the kind of Rousseauian point. And you can also think of perhaps more like less rational, but like some interesting responses to 9/11, for example, when people were saying, well, this is because people like kind of evangelist Christians were saying 9/11 happened because it's God's punishment because we're too decadent and so on. So that would be another kind of version of theodicy, that this happens for a reason. And then Voltaire kind of argued against that and said that it was senseless. The best thing we can do is to confront the meaninglessness of disasters like this. And I thought here of Stephen Fry when he was arguing in some stupid like BBC or Channel 4 segment about the existence of God, and he said, well, how could God exist when there's children with bone cancer, when they're like dying? This would be the Voltairean response. So this would be like, no, evil is not compatible with God's existence. So we see evil happening, therefore there's no God. So this leads us to the discussion of natural and moral evil. So, the Rousseauian would probably say that all evil is moral, and then the Voltairean would probably say there is natural evil that we just can't avert or do anything about, and it's completely out of our control. And the only thing we can do is just confront that senselessness. So this can lead to a kind of atheistic belief as well, because if natural evil is incompatible with a world which is supposed to be created by God and is all perfect, then of course that means that there's no God. So next one section he has, which is called the Naturalization of Evil, and he discusses 9/11 here, or the responses to it. So this is the kind of backdrop for this section, and this is an interesting section. He discusses Rousseau again, and he just discusses, and I don't speak French, I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, Amour de Sui, Amour propre, I'm probably saying it wrong, excuse me. De Sui is when the soul, when man is the sole judge of himself. He doesn't think that anything outside his own kind of self-reflection is makes a difference to what he is. And then amour propre is when another's gaze intrudes in that kind of state of completeness and satisfaction, and then we start judging ourselves by relative standards. So and it kind of disrupts our ability to be happy and to be satisfied. So for example, you can think of how people contest over an object which has a certain practical use which can make us happy, and then through the fact that we're in competition with someone else over it, it starts to become what you, in kind of Hegelian terms, you could say pure prestige. So people then merely sort of reflect on what they are and what they want, based off of these kind of completely relative, like the thing itself doesn't have any value. It's merely only because someone else wants it. You know, you think of like a child wants a toy, gets bored of playing with the toy and goes off and does something else, and then someone else comes along and uses it, and he says, hold on a minute, I want the toy. So that's basically kind of the idea here. And also, interestingly, envy stems from the Latin term indivia, which means to cast an evil eye or an evil gaze upon somebody. So there is something about envy in it kind of disrupts our a bit. What envy does in a way is it disrupts our ability to just be like this kind of totally isolated unit where we satisfy our own desires and we make ourselves happy. It kind of draws us towards something outside ourselves, and the fact that somebody else wants something, suddenly I also get drawn into a desire for it, and then and I get drawn into a competition, we could say, for it. And this is kind of the Rousseauian. This is his description of the Rousseauian kind of fall from the perfect natural state where everything is complete and whole and happy to a kind of social being where everything is miserable and terrible. So in a sense here, evil is getting caught into this conflict where we no longer act to make ourselves happy and satisfied, but we kind of act simply to compete with others, or he even says harm others, which I think is maybe a little bit too far. But and this is, I would say, this is a slightly problematic view of recognition if you were to also include, you know, Hegelian recognition into this, because I think Hegelian recognition is also to do with not just the desire for something petty because someone else wants it because it's a piece of status or something, but it's also because I want to be fully human or fully free. So it's a kind of cheap view of recognition, I would say, but he's got a point in the sense of it's an interesting kind of, I would say, piece of political theology in how we think about ourselves once we're in a civil order. According to Rousseau, a certain evil enters, and that evil is very much based around the kind of inability to satisfy and make ourselves happy, because we're suddenly caught into the gaze and the desires of the other, and we kind of lose control in a way, which is actually a very good argument of like the social media era as well, because we're constantly just engaged in other people's desires and wants, and we're kind of getting drawn out of ourselves constantly. So this was, I suppose, this was also he also brought this up because he wanted to talk about he wanted to talk about the kind of like senseless acts of like we just do things to hurt others. We don't really do things to make ourselves happy, and we become like kind of maniacal or unpredictable or evil. And 9/11 would be an example of that. Or we could say people like, you know, big states or gangs or something, I don't know, competing with each other over killing each other and destroying things around them over a piece of status or a piece of prestige and so on. And again, this prestige isn't related in his terms to anything genuinely good like freedom or being fully human, but nonetheless, there is something, I think, psychologically, psychopolitically valid there, that there is a problem with us losing control of what actually makes ourselves happy and complete, because we get drawn into the desire of others and then so on. And he's talking about catastrophes here too. So this being drawn into something is, in a sense, potential catastrophe. Okay, next section, he talks about Auschwitz, Eichmann, Hanaren'S, the banality of evil. I have to say his name again, and I'm not going to say Depoy. Depoye discusses Hanaren'S view of evil as thoughtless. How do we understand evil without absolving it? He gets into the discussion here of like the criticisms of Hanaren'S because she depicted Eichmann as banal and thoughtless. People thought at the time that she was trying to absolve the sin or reduce the guilt of the Nazis and so on. And her response was to say that she was trying to learn, she wasn't trying to describe or explain. There's a distinction between explaining and learning. And I suppose learning is like we understand with the concept of justice, we understand with the guilt not being absolved from the actor, from the agent. Um, and this again feeds into like this changing ethos which catastrophe is global catastrophe is presenting for our views of justice and moral responsibility and so on. So the distinction. So she said. So her argument was basically that learning from it, trying to create a lesson from it was understanding it rationally without absolving him, where explaining it would be absolving him. Which I thought was a good point. She was concerned with the thoughtlessness, which reminds me of Virilio's breakup of science and reason. So Paul Virilio, who does a lot of work on accidents, which is, you can see the conversation I did with Joshua Hansen on that. He talks about the substance of accidents and so on, and there's a kind of thoughtlessness to that as well, that we don't realize what we're creating. We're creating technology, which is, when we create the shipwreck. When we create nuclear energy, we create the nuclear bomb. There's a destructive element to our innovation, which we don't see. There's a kind of thoughtlessness to it. Also, because I was talking to Daniel Garner from OG Rose recently about Notes from the Pod, the book that I wrote, and he brought up a lot of autonomous rationality. It also reminds me of autonomous rationality, and he's actually written about Hanaren'S as well, so that kind of fits in the topic. Autonomous rationality, we could say, is this kind of thoughtless intelligence, or a kind of breakup of reason and truth. And of course, this is important because when we're describing the kind of technological destruction, which he finishes these little. He's got three, I suppose. He's got tsunamis. He's got 9/11. He's got Hiroshima, or he's got the Holocaust. He's got 9/11. And he's got Hiroshima, and Hiroshima is is basically the product of this thoughtless destruction. He says, apocalypse being inscribed into our future as fate, all we can do is to indefinitely postpone the final moment. And this is interesting because he refers to kind of history here, referring to this guy, Gunther Anders. He describes how Hiroshima meant history stopped. From then on, everything became about averting total destruction. It became the kind of modus operandi of history. So if you were going to think about an end of history, you could actually point to this. You could actually point to the dropping of the nuclear bomb. It was like the moment when we all realized that there can be no more like of these major geopolitical power plays. Obviously there was the Cold War, but that was kind of based around like the implicit knowledge that we could never really go to war, that this could never really happen. We're going to have to kind of deter that, even though we're constantly threatened by it the whole time, if that makes sense. He talks about the lack of, and it's interesting. He talks about the lack of hatred nukes infer, and how this risks the naturalization of evil because it becomes like the weather. And he quotes Gunther Anders, and he says, Hiroshima is everywhere because it becomes like the weather. So basically, his point here is that if evil is this like highly passionate, will, that you like a demonic will to destruction, a kind of hatred, that's a completely different evil to what he's trying to depict. He's trying to depict an evil which is basically like inscribed into our technology. So it becomes like just around us everywhere. It becomes like the weather. Like you don't need to like viscerally hate. You don't like the Hindus don't need to viscerally hate the Muslims, and the Catholics don't need to viscerally hate the Protestants in order to like kill them. You can have a one man just dropping a nuke on a country, and it's like, well, that's it. I'm just gonna go back to watching Netflix. You don't need this kind of hatred. And there's a quote here. He says, just quite good. No war in history will have been so more devoid of hatred than the war by telemurder that is to come. So this is like, I think this is a quote from Gunther Anders as well, not from I don't want to say his name again. The the Puye, the Pooh. Um, so this is a war without hatred. This is like the most destructive war in human history, and it will be a war without hatred. And that's a really interesting point to reflect on, I think. And it fits in with the whole Eichmann and the thoughtlessness, the evil of thoughtlessness, and so on. Because it's a thoughtless act. It's just like boom, build bottom up. It's not like spend a lifetime plotting the destruction of your enemy. This isn't like this isn't a passionate hatred. So, and then he ends on a kind of talk about how, to kind of summarize the destruction and violence is always somewhat has a religious undertone. There's always a religious undertone to violence. There's always some sort of violence is always sacrificial in some way or another, which is a bold statement to make. But this is kind of what he intuitively thinks, and there's a risk that we're kind of going to sacrifice the future. So he says the deaths of gods are often by suicide. If humanity was to succeed in destroying itself, one should have to say, with all respect to Gunther Anders, that this was an eminently sacrificial and religious act. Indeed, it would be the culmination of an entire religious history of humanity. If the figure of the tsunami is so commonly employed in referring to the threat of a great moral catastrophes of our time, it is because we refuse to acknowledge their eminently religious dimension. So he's talking here about how people in Nagasaki, where the bomb was dropped, refer to the crisis as a tsunami. So they've naturalized the evil of it. Like, I think he also has a point that, like, when something breaks our moral framework, to such a large extent, we don't have a way of conceiving it as evil. We kind of consider it natural. It's too much. And he has an earlier statement about the Jews going on the train going to the concentration camps. From their moral perspective, what was going to happen was impossible, so they didn't think it was going to happen. And this is what he's kind of challenging, right? So, and then here's another quote. What I have called enlightened doomsdaying is a ruse that works to wean humanity from its own violence by making violence its destiny, a destiny that has neither intention nor purpose, but that threatens to make civilized life on Earth extinct. So what he doesn't want us to do, basically, he thinks it's time to end this metaphor of tsunamis. I think he's trying to stop our conceptions of moral wrongdoing to be naturalized, because the technology to cause harm has become so without kind of hatred and so kind of inscribed into our way of life, and so large and so destructive that it's kind of it's basically inconceivable for us to even imagine the evil of it. It's just like the weather, like nukes, and also climate change. He talks a lot about climate change, and I'm not like, I have various views on climate change and so on. So I'll probably just stick to the nuke metaphors for now. But the possibility of evil through something which doesn't involve our kind of visceral hatred is something which becomes naturalized in a weird sense, because we can't really it becomes a kind of inhuman evil. Like, we can kind of understand human evil, but we can't understand inhuman evil, which is kind of beyond our comprehension. So that we have a tendency to then naturalize it. If it's beyond our comprehension, it must just be like the weather. It kind of absolves the guilt from it, I suppose you could say. And then he talks a little bit about how he rejects the problem. He rejects the solution of like sustainable growth, and that we can innovate our way out of this problem. The problem which technology has brought can't be fixed by more technology, which I think I agree with, and is a very good point. And so he basically seems to propose a kind of more spiritual and ethical solution rather than a technical one. we have to abandon the tsunami metaphor, because this is the risk we have of naturalizing evil, because it's beyond our sort of, it's beyond what we can comprehend. And he calls this kind of evil that we can't comprehend, that we have a tendency to naturalize, systemic evil. So it's different to natural or moral evil. It's the kind of systemic evil. So that's basically the kind of breakdown. I wanted just to bring up some points about it, and some critical points. Although I do think he's got like a lot of that is really good. I think that there is a change in ethics and our conceptions of justice, which is going to change, and already has changed, I think, to a certain degree. And it may not change in a good way, but it's changing anyway, because of these technologies and these catastrophes. And my example here was like that I think of often is biotechnology. And could you imagine like could you imagine, like, it's hard for us to conceive of like the crime against kind of human dignity, that like cloning people and then having like cheap or free basically slave labor would be from cloning people. That kind of, it's hard to conceive of that, like, but it's still a crime. So he's trying to make us aware of things which kind of seem to escape our kind of regular moral understanding and framework, which then become naturalized or become normalized because we can't even conceive of why it's wrong. Another example could be like pharmaceutical companies, like, giving out treatments to people, and then knowing that these medicines are going to be harmful in some way, and then just basically making like, $50 billion in a year, and then paying $5 billion in fines to the various families or individuals that were hurt by this mass experimentation, basically. Which is basically just like a higher tax rate for, damaging people. I think that's another good example of like, what are you going to do in that case? Like, just fine people? It's like, really? Is that really sufficient? Is that a sufficient deterrent here? You're going to have to come with something with a bit more balls, a bit more teeth there. I think that's another way our ethics are going to change. You saw it with the lockdowns. And I'm not saying that I agree with the way the lockdowns were done or anything, but there was an argument to be made, which is why it was so difficult for, suddenly because you're virally contagious, and you might, you have to, like, breathing around someone was never considered in any way harmful to them before. And there was a massive shift in how we conceive of, for better or worse, there was a massive shift in how we conceive of our own effect and harm on other people, which went beyond like what a typical enlightened courtroom would do. It's like, did you intend to cause them harm? Did you kind of go out of your way to actively cause them harm? Right? Which is why there's a different punishment for murder and for manslaughter, because the intent and the kind of effort you put in to do the crime, in the enlightened kind of bourgeois sense, is kind of the basic the basic standard for how much of a crime it was. So that was disrupted by our kind of passive criminality, right? Which is kind of what he's talking about here. So just a few critiques. I would say that, in attempting to accelerate our awareness of the threat, do we end up creating a totally unreasonable and emotionally volatile response? And I'm thinking here of like Paul Virilio, to bring it up again, Administration of Fear. So that was a great book, and it's very much about how we lack a kind of reasonable and we say courageous as well response to events, to catastrophes and so on. We're for various reasons, which are complicated, and maybe I'll make another video on that. But there is a risk here of basically saying, and this is the next part, like, we know but we don't believe. Okay, so then what? So let's say climate change. It's like, okay, we know there's going to be like all these bad things are going to happen with climate change, but we don't really believe it. It's like, well, then what do we do about that? I mean, do we just get hysterical? Do we just get histrionic? Do we just get really emotional? in order to motivate ourselves, because there is a problem there, and it's been proven with environmental groups being like really cynical and creating these like deliberately exaggerating how much of a disaster it's going to be. Like, we're all going to die. Or like there was a new segment I think they did on like BBC or something where the journalist was criticizing them for saying, first, we're going to run out of food, and once we run out of food, everyone's going to get raped. And it was like, wait a minute, why are you talking about rape? This has nothing to do with climate change. He's like, well, if we run out of food, then what? People are gonna, he was basically trying to invoke like a complete like civilizational collapse, and we're in a complete state of nature where everyone just kills each other. He was invoking a kind of political theology, basically, pertaining to the kind of social cohesion and failure of law and so on in society, which climate change could, I suppose, arguably undermine. But you see these kind of almost cynical attempts, and they normally justify it to themselves by saying, well, if we motivate people to change their behavior, we're going to avert this big massive catastrophe, so it's justified. Like, you can kind of lie about how bad something's going to be, because even if it's 50% as bad or 20% as bad, the very fact that you've averted that 20% justifies lying about it being 100% worse. So there is that kind of ethos as well, which comes out, which is obviously a huge problem for obvious reasons. I think there's also a bit of like his talk about violence and how we need to wean ourselves off our violence and so on. I think these issues bring out that we don't just need a philosophy of catastrophe, and we don't just need a philosophy of justice. We also need a philosophy of violence, because I don't want to, lump in all violence into one category and be like, it's all bad, and we can easily infer passively that I'm being violent because I'm not obeying some sort of regulations which are designed to avert supposed or crises or harm. You know what I mean? Like, that's a different sort of action than I'm going out of my way to hurt somebody. That's a different sort of thing. There's also heroic violence. There's also the fact that it's like, do you expect countries to never go to war ever again because they have nukes? Like, what if they develop anti-nuclear defense systems? What if there's a cause that's so important? You know what I mean? Like, here's an example. What if the Nazis developed nukes first? It's like, well, we're just not going to go and liberate the Jews from the concentration camps because they have nukes, and we have to avert. You know what I mean? Like, there are things you have to put over risk aversion. Like, risk aversion can't be, even if it's nukes. It can't. I struggle to get into this kind of almost a kind of utopian passivity, where and my fear here would be that, like, in this utopian passivity, where there's no cause that can, because nukes are such a bad, because nukes deter conflict and war, and violence basically so much, because they're so destructive themselves, that we give up on causes which are higher and more meaningful, which put our bodily self-preservation as a kind of lower thing, and we overcome our bodily self-preservation for a higher goal. If that goes away, we don't have anything higher which is more important than our bodily self-preservation, then fear itself becomes a kind of sacred object. Fear itself becomes something which is sacred, because it's like it becomes a salvation. It's the only thing that's holding everything together. So there's problems with alarmism there, and there's also problems with a kind of depoliticization of everything for the sake of a kind of disaster aversion, a kind of theology of disaster aversion. And there's also a political question of who is the savior. It's like, okay, well, if we need to be saved because we're destined to head into this global cosmic destruction, then who's going to save us? There's kind of a political question which comes into that, of like, well, what authority is justified to make the decisions to avert and so on, and who's going to make the sacrifices to avert? I mean, and I worry about this sort of philosophy dealing with catastrophes ends up really depoliticizing for the sake of a kind of emotionally volatile, kind of secularized theology of total destruction, if that makes any sense. So that's basically the criticisms. But other than the criticisms, I think there's a lot of really good points in there. I think the point about having a not relying on science to fix and technology to fix the problems which science and technology have caused is a very valid point. I do think he's right that our conceptions of justice are going to change because of global catastrophes, and that's inevitable. Whether they change for the better or the worse is another question, but it's inevitable. I think also that he's got a point about the underlying religious nature to violence, which can often be perceived, which can often have a kind of sacrificial role. Um, Again, you saw that with the lockdowns, like so. The, that like all of those are really good points. So he's got some very good points. It's just that I think that it brings up more questions which then need to be answered, I suppose you could say. So yeah, that was basically it. It was a really good book. It's a short little book, only like 60 pages. I would recommend it.